Search your memory. Go back to a specific moment in your past, a boardroom, an upscale dinner, a high-stakes negotiation, or even a casual conversation where you were surrounded by people playing a very recognizable social game. Everyone knows their role. Everyone speaks the agreed-upon language. Then, someone opens their mouth, and the frequency of the entire room shifts. They do not raise their voice. They do not try to dominate the space with loud, polished charisma. They don't flex a manufactured resume. But the words they use, the terrifyingly sharp connections they draw, perhaps referencing the tactical maneuvers of a 17th century warlord to explain a subtle shift in modern financial markets, feel completely alien. They casually drop a truth about your own industry that the veterans who have worked in it for decades are too terrified to say out loud, and then just as quickly, they fall utterly silent. You feel a sudden drop in the room's temperature. You feel it in your gut before your conscious brain can even process what just happened. That man is an anomaly. He is not special in the way modern society praises. He is not a harmless prodigy or an eccentric intellectual. He is something far colder. He is a chemical compound that simply does not form in natural domestic climates, and he is incredibly dangerous because whatever the rest of the room was planning to execute, he has already seen through it. He is 5 steps ahead, and the system didn't even register his arrival. Today, we are going to dissect exactly why this type of predator exists. We are going to uncover why there are so few of them walking among us, and why the established hierarchy is entirely blind to their movements. Let's look at the first asymmetry, the architecture of a mind constructed from absolute zero. The phrase self-taught has been thoroughly hijacked. It has been sterilized by a culture addicted to shortcuts. Binge-watching a weekend playlist of productivity hacks does not make you self-taught. Memorizing 3 quotes from Seneca to sound profound at a networking event is a cheap parlor trick. The genuine definition of a self-taught man is brutal, and it explains why this specific type of individual is a statistical ghost. A truly self-taught mind is a structure built entirely without a survival kit. Think about how the masses are conditioned. Modern education hands you a prefabricated cognitive house. The syllabus dictates the boundaries of your imagination. The professor feeds you the approved answers. The standardized test confirms if you were an obedient participant who remembered what he was told. The grading system pats you on the head. You didn't build the house. You simply walked through a staged property, took a few pictures of the interior, and confidently convinced yourself you were a master architect. The self-taught man walked into the wilderness and sourced his own stone. He had to figure out what questions were actually worth asking. He had to determine the chaotic sequence of his own intellectual evolution. He graded his own progress in the dark, constantly tortured by the very real possibility that he was a fool, completely incompetent to make these judgments in the first place. Most men will shatter under that specific type of psychological pressure. In the late 1970s, the psychologist Albert Bandura released a foundational framework from Stanford University. He called it self-efficacy. Stripped of the sterile academic jargon, self-efficacy is the deep, unbreakable internal conviction that you can bend reality to your will, that you can produce the exact outcome you intend to produce. Bandura's decades of research revealed an uncomfortable truth that modern institutions hate to admit. This deep internal conviction is the single strongest predictor of whether a man can survive complex, agonizing learning. It beats raw IQ. It annihilates family pedigree. It destroys the supposed advantage of an elite professor. But here is the catch. Here is the velvet dagger. Self-efficacy cannot be downloaded into your brain. It cannot be bought with tuition money. It can only be earned. You build it by voluntarily stepping into the abyss, failing miserably, bleeding, adjusting your strategy, and clawing your way back to your feet, while absolutely no one is coming to save you. Carl Jung understood this as the agonizing road to individuation. It is the bloody process of severing yourself from the comfortable, shared illusions of the collective herd to forge a singular, unshakable identity. Every single time a mentor, a grading system, or a societal safety net steps in to rescue you from the struggle, your psychological immune system weakens. Every time you drag yourself out of the pit alone, you become a little more lethal. The institutional credential system, by its very design, exists to catch students before they hit the ground. The self-taught man was never caught. He hit the concrete. He tasted his own failure, and he got up in an empty room. Stop for a second. Look at your own life, your own mind. How many of your core beliefs, your skills, your strategies were handed to you on a silver platter by a system that needs you to stay predictable? The anomaly in the room operates differently because his psychological architecture is built from a denser material. His mind was calibrated by the unforgiving laws of reality, not the polite applause of a graduating class. When he steps into a space, the men who base their entire self-worth on performance reviews, degrees, and social approval instinctively recoil. They cannot map his coordinates. The social hierarchy ranking system fails to register him. That is the first reason he is an invisible threat. But the architecture of his mind is only the foundation. The real danger lies in how he processes the world around him. The second asymmetry separates the predators from the prey in the realm of information. The self-taught man absolutely refuses to outsource his truth. I want you to listen to this very carefully, because it is going to sting. Almost nothing you hold in your mind as an absolute fact has been genuinely verified by you. Think about it. The unshakable opinions you fiercely defend about macroeconomics, the complex inner workings of human psychology, the geopolitical history of the world, even the biological mechanics of your own body. You have verified almost none of it. It was handed down to you by an authority figure you were told to trust, who received it from someone they trusted in a long, unbroken chain of assumed competence. You do not hold your beliefs because you have rigorously inspected them. You hold your beliefs because of social proximity. In 2002, cognitive researchers Leonid Rosenblit and Frank Keel at Yale University exposed this exact human vulnerability. They coined a terrifying term, the illusion of explanatory depth. They brought subjects into a lab and asked them a deceptively simple question. On a scale from 1 to 7, how well do you understand how a mundane object works? A ballpoint pen, a flush toilet, a zipper. Unsurprisingly, most people confidently ranked themselves at a 5 or a 6. They felt intelligent. They felt secure. Then, the trap was sprung. The researchers handed them a blank piece of paper and asked them to write down the exact step-by-step mechanical chain of causation that makes a zipper function. The confidence evaporated. The ratings instantly collapsed. When violently pushed to produce the actual mechanism rather than just pointing to an abstract concept, the vast majority of humans failed completely. They had tragically mistaken mere familiarity for genuine understanding because you have used a zipper every day of your life. Your brain tricks you into believing you comprehend its engineering. This is how the average man interacts with almost all knowledge. This is the default human condition because your brain is biologically hardwired to be cognitively cheap. We are built for social epistemics. We blindly farm out our truth verification to the tribe, the accredited expert, the news anchor, or the algorithm. It saves energy, and it keeps you safely embedded in the herd. This is where things get dark, and this is where the self-taught man diverges from the pack. Without a professor to stamp his ideas as correct, without a peer group to validate his assumptions, he is forced into a state of epistemic isolation. He adopts the ancient Stoic discipline of assent, a practice mastered by Marcus Aurelius. The philosopher-emperor trained his mind to act as a ruthless border guard, explicitly refusing to grant assent or agreement to any impression, theory, or belief that he had not personally, brutally interrogated. The self-taught man operates with this same paranoid discipline. He runs his own confirmations. He constantly asks himself the most terrifying question a man can ask. Do I actually understand the mechanics of this? Or have I just been standing next to it long enough that it feels familiar? To understand the sheer power of this mindset, look at Eric Hoffer. Hoffer was not a man born into privilege. He never walked the manicured lawns of an Ivy League campus. He was orphaned young, worked as a migrant farm laborer through the bleeding heart of the Great Depression, and spent the last quarter century of his life sweating as a longshoreman on the docks of San Francisco. But between his back-breaking shifts, Hoffer sat in public libraries and read obsessively. He had no syllabus. He had no academic advisor guiding his thoughts. In 1951, he published a masterpiece titled The True Believer, completely dissecting the dark psychology of mass movements and fanaticism. The book was a raw, unfiltered observation of human nature. Dwight Eisenhower, the President of the United States, kept a copy on his desk. Today, credentialed sociologists are forced to assign Hoffer's book in the very universities he was never permitted to attend. Why could a man hauling cargo on the docks write with a piercing clarity that eluded the most highly decorated academics of his era? Because Hoffer had not been trained to flatter the prevailing assumptions of a university faculty. He verified every single theory in his head against the grim reality he witnessed with his own eyes, in the breadlines, on the freezing docks, in the desperate political rallies of the 1930s. He possessed no academic faction to defend. He had no lucrative university career to protect. His truth was forged in the fire of his own reality. This brings us to a core Machiavellian truth. A man who holds no loyalty to an ideological master is the most dangerous entity to the ruling class. Every other man in that room carries a belief system inherited from an institution, and because the institution gave it to him, the institution controls him. He must remain loyal to keep his status. But the self-taught man carries beliefs he has forged in the crucible of his own verification. You cannot manipulate a man like this. You cannot threaten him with excommunication from a church he never joined. You cannot terrorize him with the disapproval of experts he has already cross-examined and found severely lacking. He is intellectually bulletproof, and because his mind answers to no external authority, he does not recognize the artificial boundaries that society uses to keep everyone else tightly locked in their designated lanes. The third asymmetry is the absolute refusal to recognize boundaries. Look at how the modern world is constructed. It is an empire of tiny, heavily guarded boxes. The university system, the corporate ladder, the scientific community, they are all fragmented into hyper-specialized departments. This is not an accident. It is a structural necessity for control, to secure tenure, An academic must specialize. To climb the corporate ranks, you must fiercely defend your microscopic patch of turf. To be respected by your peers, you must stay precisely in your designated lane. Over time, a fatal psychological blindness sets in. The decorated economist learns to completely ignore evolutionary biology. The esteemed historian openly mocks behavioral psychology. Two brilliant experts can sit in offices 50 feet apart, analyzing the exact same human phenomenon, speaking completely different vocabularies, and they will never once synthesize their findings. They protect their own. The self-taught man never signed that peace treaty. Because he does not belong to a specific department, he wanders like a ghost through the labyrinth of human knowledge. He follows raw obsession instead of a mandated curriculum. He consumes a dense text on neurochemistry, and when a footnote casually references classical military strategy, he immediately pivots. He does not stop at the border checkpoint, because nobody ever showed him where the border was drawn. And then, something terrifying happens, something the lifelong blinkered specialists will almost never experience. He begins to see the invisible threads. He spots a recurring pattern in behavioral economics that perfectly maps onto a concept in cybersecurity, and he uses a third framework from Stoic philosophy to fuse them together into an entirely new weapon. He becomes an intellectual smuggler, dragging explosive insights across borders that the institutions fought desperately to keep sealed. Robert Greene details this perfectly in his Laws of Power. The ultimate tactical advantage in any theater of war or business is formlessness. When you allow society to force you into a specialized box, you become rigid. You become highly predictable. A man who defines himself strictly as an accountant, an engineer, or a marketer operates within a fixed, transparent set of rules, making him incredibly easy to manipulate, outmaneuver, and eventually replace. But the borderless mind is a shapeshifter. He is fluid. Let me interrupt you for a second. Look closely at your own life. Look at the title on your business card or the identity you project to the world. Where have you allowed the system to put you in a cage, simply so other people can feel comfortable understanding what you do? Most men die in that cage, proudly defending the bars. The anomaly simply walks through them. Consider the story of Heinrich Schliemann in the 19th century. He was a ruthless German businessman who built a massive, self-made fortune, trading indigo and saltpeter. Then, deep into his 40s, he decided to do something that the academic elite of his day found completely hilarious. He decided he was going to unearth the lost ancient city of Troy. At the time, credentialed archaeologists universally agreed that Homer's Iliad was nothing more than mythological poetry. It was a beautiful fairy tale, entirely useless as a geographical or navigational tool. Schliemann, who had fiercely taught himself ancient Greek just so he could access the raw, uncorrupted source material, did something they considered profoundly stupid. He treated the ancient poem as a literal treasure map. He took Homer's exact descriptions of battlements, distances, and terrain, walked through the dust of northwestern Turkey, and started digging at a desolate mound called Hizar-Lik. His methods were undoubtedly crude. He dug too fast. He made reckless errors that a formally trained specialist would have meticulously avoided. But he also found Troy. Beneath that dirt, he uncovered 9 layered cities stacked across millennia, one of which directly aligned with the Trojan War. A self-taught merchant, using a poet as his guide, had discovered a legendary civilization that the highest intellectual authorities on Earth had smugly dismissed as fiction. The point of this story is not that Schliemann was a flawless genius and the academics were fools. The point is entirely structural. He possessed the ability to see a reality they were utterly blind to, because their specialized training strictly dictated which sources were credible and which were garbage. Schliemann read Homer the way a child reads a set of instructions, taking the text at its absolute word, stripping away the academic noise. The specialists were far too sophisticated to read an ancient text literally. Their sophisticated training was the exact mechanism of their blindness. The self-taught man operates with this same dangerous literalism, stripping away the rules that govern the masses. But crossing these borders and ignoring these rules guarantees catastrophic collisions, which brings us to the actual psychological mutation that makes him so impossible to defeat. Here is where this conversation becomes genuinely uncomfortable. Everything we have discussed so far, the self-built mental architecture, the paranoid verification of belief, the fearless crossing of intellectual borders, these are rare traits. Yes, you might even find a scattered handful of credentialed academics who quietly possess them. But these intellectual quirks are not what makes this individual truly dangerous. The actual threat is not intellectual at all. It is something much colder. It is something mechanical. The fourth asymmetry is his completely alien relationship with failure. He uses failure as a ruthless teacher, while the rest of the world has been conditioned to fear it as a final verdict. Think about the psychological conditioning of every formal educational system on Earth. From the moment you sit at a small desk as a child, you are systematically trained to view a mistake as a moral failing. The red ink on the test paper is permanent. The disappointment of the authority figure is a tangible punishment. Giving the wrong answer in front of 30 of your peers is a micro-humiliation, a trauma that is repeated thousands of times throughout your developmental years. This pattern violently installs itself in your subconscious. By the time the average man is handed his university degree at 22, being wrong no longer feels like a simple data point. It feels like a devastating identity wound. The self-taught man bypassed this conditioning entirely. When you forge your own path in the dark, there is no authority figure standing over you to be embarrassed in front of. Your miscalculations are not graded on a curve. Instead, they are punished by a mechanism that is infinitely more useful. Reality simply pushes back. The argument you constructed collapses. The software code you wrote throws a fatal error. The financial model shatters. The prototype breaks. The wrongness in this environment is not social. It is strictly physical. It costs you time and sweat, but it never costs you your social status. This creates a profound psychological mutation, one that perfectly mirrors Carl Jung's concept of the death of the ego. The credentialed man spends his entire life aggressively protecting his ego. He is terrified of looking foolish, so he clings desperately to the safety of established consensus. But the self-taught man is forced to execute a voluntary ego death. He willingly sacrifices his pride on the bloody altar of absolute competence. Because nobody is watching him fail, his ego is deeply detached from the outcome. Consider the groundbreaking work of Anders Ericsson, the cognitive psychologist whose research forms the bedrock of modern skill acquisition. The masses have completely distorted his findings into the catchy, marketable 10,000-hour rule. But Ericsson's actual discovery was far darker and much more specific. He found that the true dividing line between an elite performer and an average participant is not the sheer volume of hours practiced. It is a grueling, agonizing process he called deliberate practice. The structural requirement of deliberate practice is forcing yourself into high-frequency, continuous engagement with your own errors. Read that again. To achieve genuine mastery, you must be willing to stare directly into the abyss of your own incompetence without flinching. Most human beings cannot sustain this for more than a few minutes. The fragile ego violently rebels. The neurological shame system fires off warning signals, and the brain desperately seeks the comfort of distraction. This is why the masses plateau. The self-taught man, however, had to build an extreme tolerance to this exact discomfort just to survive. His entire methodology of learning depends on his ability to aggressively hunt for his own flaws. To see this ruthlessness in action, look at the race to invent powered flight at the dawn of the 20th century. On one side, you had Samuel Pierpont Langley. He was the highly decorated secretary of the Smithsonian Institution, a deeply respected scientist, and a man heavily funded by the United States War Department. He had teams of assistants and a massive press corps documenting his every move. In 1903, he launched his heavily publicized prototype off a houseboat into the Potomac River. It immediately sank like a stone. 2 months later, he tried again. Same river, same humiliating result. Meanwhile, 2 high school dropouts and bicycle mechanics from Ohio, Wilbur and Orville Wright, were quietly working on a desolate beach in Kitty Hawk. They possessed no university backing, 0 government funding, and no public attention. For 4 brutal years, they deliberately crashed their gliders into the sand, making microscopic adjustments to their wing designs after every single failure. When they realized the published academic data on aerodynamics was flawed, they didn't write a paper complaining about it. They built the world's first wind tunnel in their bicycle shop and generated their own data. Langley was paralyzed by the public pressure of trying not to fail. The Wright brothers spent years failing in absolute privacy, extracting raw data from every shattered piece of wood. When Langley eventually retired in public humiliation, the bicycle mechanics flew. The lesson here is not a cheesy motivational poster about trying again. The terrifying lesson is that the self-taught man possesses a completely different metabolism for wrongness. He digests failure exponentially faster than you do. He is not slowed down by the heavy friction of a bruised ego. This is exactly why, in any industry that is undergoing violent disruption, the established expert is always at a lethal disadvantage. The expert's reputation relies heavily on defending an obsolete model. For him, being wrong is a career-ending catastrophe. For the self-taught man, being wrong is just breakfast. But this is where the illusion shatters. Most people stop here, assuming that this extreme resilience is the final piece of the puzzle. They believe the danger lies solely in his ability to learn quickly. But you don't. You understand that this metabolism for failure is just the preparation for his ultimate weapon. The final mutation isn't about how he learns. It is about how society completely loses its ability to govern him. The 5th and final asymmetry is the most terrifying to the ruling class. This man cannot be governed. To understand why, you must understand the cold mechanics of how power actually operates. Control is rarely about physical force. It is about psychological leverage. A system controls a man by identifying exactly what he craves. A prestigious title, a corner office, a sense of belonging, or simply a validating pat on the head from his peers, and then forcing him to perform tricks to acquire it. If the institution holds the keys to what you desperately want, you will automatically adjust your personality, your morals, and your behavior to appease the institution. This is not necessarily a malicious conspiracy. It is simply the biological reality of social mammals. The self-taught man severed this invisible leash on day one. He had no other choice. During those brutal years of solitary learning, the system offered him absolutely nothing. There was no professor handing out gold stars. There was no corporate salary contingent upon his obedience. There was no peer review committee whispering that he belonged. He only had the cold, unforgiving feedback of reality. Did the mathematical model predict the outcome, or did it fail? Did the code execute, or did it crash? Over years of this isolation, the fundamental wiring of his brain was permanently altered. Carl Rogers, the mid-century pioneer of humanistic psychology, gave this exact phenomenon a name. He divided the human psyche into two operational frameworks: the external locus of evaluation and the internal locus. The external locus is the default setting of the herd. You judge the value of your work by how loudly the tribe applauds it, and you judge your own self-worth by how society categorizes you. The internal locus, however, is alien and deeply unsettling to the masses. When you operate from the inside out, you judge your work strictly by its objective performance in the real world, and you judge your character by a private, draconian code of standards that has absolutely nothing to do with public consensus. Rogers noted that achieving an internal locus usually takes a lifetime of painful psychological evolution. The self-taught man started there. He never had the luxury of an alternative. Here is the darkest Machiavellian truth you will ever learn. You cannot manipulate a man who wants absolutely nothing from you. When you surgically remove your thirst for external validation, you become utterly immune to the traditional levers of social control. The institution cannot threaten to exile him from a club he never asked to join. They cannot bribe him with a meaningless credential he does not respect. They cannot manipulate him through the fear of public humiliation because he made peace with looking foolish years ago in the dark. A person who cannot be ranked, who cannot be ideologically captured, who cannot be threatened, and who cannot be shamed is a fatal glitch in the social matrix. Systems survive by modeling human behavior. The corporation models the employee, the politician models the voter, the algorithm models the consumer. When the model accurately predicts behavior, the system thrives. But when the model breaks, the apparatus panics. This is exactly why, when he walks into that room we talked about at the beginning, the atmosphere fractures. People frantically search for the usual psychological handles to grab onto. His need to be liked, his fear of failure, his tribal loyalty. They reach out and find nothing but smooth, impenetrable glass. They react with hostility, blind deference, or very rarely, genuine curiosity. He watches all three reactions with the exact same cold detachment. This is why every major power structure in history has only tolerated self-taught minds when they could successfully co-opt them. Give the dangerous Anomaly a title, give him a laboratory, bribe him into the fold so he can be managed. The genuine ones, the men who refused the bribe, usually died misunderstood, heavily mocked, or actively hunted by the regimes they lived under. So, the rarity you sense when you look into the eyes of this kind of man is not what you initially thought. It is not raw intelligence. There are millions of high IQ individuals desperately working as obedient cogs, terrified to voice a single original thought. It is not his access to knowledge. You hold the entire archive of human history in your pocket right now, for free. The rarity is the brutal, self-forged architecture. It is the borderless wandering. It is the metabolism that digests failure like oxygen. It is the locus of evaluation sitting securely inside his own skull. But understand this before you decide to walk away from the herd. These traits are not divine gifts. They are psychological deformations. They are the permanent scars left behind when a human being spends years operating in the void without anyone confirming they are doing it correctly. The years of unverified work are agonizing. You will be wrong in absolute isolation for a very long time, and no one will be there to announce when you have finally become right. You must develop the terrifying ability to know it for yourself. The masses will never become this, not because the knowledge is hidden, but because the loneliness is simply too heavy to bear. This is the exact point where most men turn back. But if you are still here, you are not most men. You realize that what we discuss on this channel is inherently dangerous to the established order. The algorithms that govern this platform are designed to suppress this exact type of psychological liberation. They want you docile, predictable, and dependent. That is why the rawest, most uncensored power strategies, the tactical blueprints and dark psychology frameworks I cannot legally or practically expose in public, are locked away. They live inside the Velvet Dagger Inner Circle on Patreon. For less than the cost of a cheap drink, you get the unredacted scripts, the private psychological breakdowns, and the exact methods the system actively punishes me for sharing here. If this video cracked the door, the Inner Circle blows it off the hinges. The link is in the description. The choice is yours. Stay in the comfortable light with the herd, or step into the dark and build your own architecture.